Welcome to BBC News, broadcasting to viewers in North America and around the world. I'm Lewis Vaughan-Jones. Our top stories. As the conflict in Syria continues, aid agencies say over 50,000 people have fled Afrin in the last few days alone. The British Foreign Secretary accuses President Putin of being behind the nerve agent attack on Sergei Skripal and his daughter.
We think it overwhelmingly likely that it was his decision to direct the use of a nerve agent on the streets of the UK, on the streets of Europe, for the first time since the Second World War.
The FBI's deputy is fired by the US Attorney General. Andrew McCabe was criticised by the President for his part in investigating Hillary Clinton and Russia's role in the 2016 election. Jumping to safety, a dozen people are injured when a ski lift goes out of control in a ski resort in Georgia. Welcome to BBC News. A Turkish airstrike has reportedly hit the main hospital in the Syrian town of Afrin, killing 9 people. It's not immediately clear whether medical staff are among the dead. Turkey's military and its Syrian allies have denied hitting civilians in their offensive against the Kurdish militia who control the northern town. Around 30,000 people have fled the area in recent days, Lebou Diseko reports.
An exodus. The seemingly endless stream of civilians leaving Afrin. Desperation punctuated by the sound of despair. Tens of thousands of people are said to have left the city near Syria's border with Turkey. The United Nations says 50,000 have left in the last few days alone.
We have no money, we have nothing, and we have kids. All of us left our houses. Where can we go?
Houses and buildings are bombarded, and this is why we left the city of Afrin. Human rights organisations must speak about those things.
I'm Arab. I have 6 children fighting on the front line. We will not abandon Afrin. I want to come back there. I just want to find shelter for those children, and I will come back straight away to Afrin.
This is what they are escaping. Turkey is bombarding the mainly Kurdish town, trying to force out fighters from the YPG. Turkey calls the Kurdish militia terrorists, but the group has been key in the fight against the so-called Islamic State, which is why the US has been backing it. It's perhaps Afrin's proximity to the border that has made Turkey feel so threatened. Turkish fighters now have almost completely encircled the town. On the other side of the country, just outside the capital, Damascus, another big military operation, this time in eastern Ghouta. Syrian government forces, helped by Russia, are trying to retake the area from the opposition. Calls for a ceasefire have been ignored. It's thought 80 people were killed by Russian airstrikes on Friday. 14 of them were children. Thousands of civilians have now made the journey out of town. But 7 years into this conflict and with no end in sight, the future for people here looks bleak. Lebou Diseko, BBC News.
There's been a swift and angry response from the Kremlin after the British Foreign Secretary said it was overwhelmingly likely that Vladimir Putin personally took the decision to use a nerve agent on a former Russian spy in the UK. Moscow said Boris Johnson's comments were shocking and unforgivable. Our diplomatic correspondent James Landale's report contains some flashing images.
Boris Johnson brought the Polish foreign minister to a Battle of Britain museum today, a memorial to a war fought in the air.
Every single plane that England and Britain had was up in the sky.
And the Foreign Secretary used the opportunity to push forward Britain's current battle with Russia, fought this time over the airwaves, blaming Vladimir Putin personally for the nerve agent attack in Salisbury.
Our quarrel is with Putin's Kremlin and with his decision, and we think it overwhelmingly likely that it was his decision to direct the use of a nerve agent on the streets of the UK, on the streets of Europe, for the first time since the Second World War. That is why we're at odds with Russia.
Today, President Putin visited a medical centre in St. Petersburg ahead of Sunday's elections. His spokesman issued an angry statement accusing Mr. Johnson of a shocking and unpardonable breach of diplomatic etiquette. The Kremlin confirmed that some British diplomats based here at the embassy in Moscow would be expelled, an announcement officials said could come at any moment. A response to the UK's decision to expel 23 Russian intelligence officers who'll leave London next Tuesday. Once again, Russia's foreign minister denied any involvement in the Salisbury attack.
I don't really want to comment on the current situation anymore. Let it stay on the conscience of those who have started this shameless, groundless, Russophobic game.
And as for the undiplomatic language of the Defence Secretary, Gavin Williamson,
he says Russia should go away and shut up. Well, maybe he lacks education. I don't know.
officials here at the Foreign Office believe that the robustness of Britain's response and the unity of the Western allies has surprised Russia. And they say they are ready for any form of retaliation coming from Moscow. As one source said, we've got more stuff in the locker. It's now almost 2 weeks since the former Russian intelligence officer Sergei Skripal and his daughter Yulia were poisoned with something Russia's London ambassador named today as Novichok A234, a delayed casualty nerve agent. Downing Street said officials from the chemical weapons watchdog would come to Britain imminently to start verifying the nerve agent. The investigation in Salisbury focused on Mr. Skripal's car, potentially containing clues about how he and his daughter were poisoned. The police here were still in their protective gear, still investigating, still making the streets safe. James Landau, BBC News.
Well, meanwhile, police in London have opened a criminal investigation into the mysterious death of another Russian exile, Nikolai Glushkov, who was found at his home on Monday. A post-mortem examination suggested he'd been strangled, although he died just a week after the attack on Sergei Skripal and his daughter. Officers aren't linking the two cases so far. Here's Tom Simons, and again, there's flash photography.
It was an ominous development, given what has happened elsewhere. Monday night, a 68-year-old man found dead, his body taken for a post-mortem examination. Ominous because Nikolai Glushkov was Russian, a political exile, #1 on that country's list of people it would like sent back to Russia. Not that his neighbours had much idea of his background.
I think he presented as a normal Englishman. I didn't know he was Russian. It's horrible to be, I mean, on your doorstep for one thing, but to happen to him, I mean, it must be a horrid thing to have happen, and the daughter must be terribly upset.
All week, his house has been the subject of a detailed search, the tents for protecting items of interest. A pathologist has concluded that Nikolai Glushkov died as a result of compression of the neck, suggesting strangulation, but detectives are clear they are keeping an open mind. They'll be looking at all aspects of his life and, of course, his past. But the stakes for them are high, not least because of the possible consequences for Britain's relationship with Russia. In the 1990s, Glushkov was director of Russia's state airline, Aeroflot. But in 1999, he was charged with fraud and money laundering. After 5 years in prison, he fled to the UK and was given political asylum. Among his friends here was the Russian billionaire Boris Berezovsky, a prominent critic of Vladimir Putin. Found dead in 2013 at his former wife's Berkshire home. The coroner recorded an open verdict. But Nikolai Glushkov was convinced that Berezovsky and other Russian exiles had been murdered. This week, Glushkov was due to appear in court in London. The Russian authorities were continuing to pursue him for more than £100 million of Aeroflot's money. Did his past make him a target? Russia's sternest critics have no problem believing that.
Mr. Glushkov's death fits into a wider pattern over the last 12 years or so of Kremlin opponents dropping dead across Europe. Now, the consequences for the Kremlin of this were limited for far too long. The UK response has recently been much stronger, but there's still an awful lot more that we could do.
But it's clear to take the strongest possible action, Britain will have to rely on the gathering of solid evidence. So the world watches another complex investigation unfold.
In the past hour, it's been announced that the former number 2 at the FBI has been fired by the US Attorney General Jeff Sessions. Andrew McCabe was disliked by President Trump and faced accusations that he misled Justice Department officials in an investigation. He says it's a setup. And in another twist, Mr. McCabe was due to retire in just 2 days. Now, a significant part of his pension might not be paid. Well, let's get more on this from our correspondent in Washington, Chris Buckler. Chris, another extraordinary development here. It's quite complicated. Could you just walk us through what's happened here?
And yet another late-night sacking comes connected, if not directly, from the White House itself. Andrew McCabe basically oversaw a controversial investigation into Hillary Clinton that took place during 2016's presidential election. Now, during that, he allowed some representatives from the FBI to brief a reporter. And the questions now become about exactly whether he was forthcoming or not about what he allowed them to brief. Now, and the FBI's Office of Professional Responsibility, which looks after professional standards, said that there was a lack of candour there. Essentially, he was not forthcoming, which is a very serious offence within the FBI, and they had recommended action was taken against him. So the Attorney General, Jeff Sessions, has taken that action tonight, and he has fired him, as you mentioned, just a matter of 36 hours before his 50th birthday and 36 hours before he was due to retire. He had stepped down already from the post, but he was due to formally retire after more than 20 years of service with the FBI. He would have been entitled to a full pension, but of course that now is in doubt because he has been fired. But what has also happened tonight is we have a full and very lengthy statement from Andrew McCabe, and he is very strong on it. He criticises President Trump for amplifying things, not least on Twitter. You might remember one tweet from President Trump some months ago in which he says FBI Deputy Director Andrew McCabe is racing the clock to retire with full benefits, 90 days to go, ? So he feels that President Trump has turned this into a political situation. He feels he has been the victim of a political firing, and he says that is specifically because of events that he witnessed whenever President Trump fired the director of the FBI, James Comey.
Okay, another extraordinary development. Chris, thank you very much. Chris Buckler in Washington there. Well, stay with us on BBC News. Still to come, a dozen people are injured after a ski lift malfunctions and moves into reverse at a resort in the mountains of Georgia. This is BBC News, the latest headlines. Aid agencies say over 50,000 people have fled Afrin in the last few days alone. Syrian allies deny hitting civilians in their offensive against the Kurdish militia who control the northern town. The British Foreign Secretary accuses President Putin of being behind the nerve agent attack on Sergei Skripal and his daughter. The Kremlin calls the comments shocking and unforgivable. Tens of thousands of Slovaks have been protesting in cities across the country about the murder of a journalist investigating corruption. They're calling for early elections, unsatisfied by the resignation on Thursday of the Prime Minister, Robert Fico. It's the third consecutive Friday to have seen mass demonstrations over Jan Kuciak's killing, Nimesh Thacker reports.
It's estimated at least 60,000 people joined rallies calling for fresh elections and an end to corruption. The gatherings have been held for the last 3 weeks and were prompted by the killing of journalist Jan Kuciak and his fiancée Martina Kaznerova. Several people were arrested and then released. No one has been charged. Activists say Mr. Kuciak was investigating alleged corruption linked to Italian organised crime. Critics say the government failed to act when his unfinished story was published after his murder in February. The family of the victims told reporters they wanted justice.
Pretože Martinina a Jankova krv nebola preliata len tak, pre nič za nič. Oni bojovali za spravodlivosť, tak patrilo by sa, aby tu spravodlivosť vzhľadom na ich životy bola.
The political pressure has forced the resignation of Prime Minister Robert Fico, but he's claimed his deputy and the government has a mandate to serve its full 4-year term. This has left many unimpressed.
The whole government should fall and people should decide again in the new elections. This would be the fairest solution.
I came to support the right thing so I would not have to leave my country, and in order to start feeling good and to save this place.
Protests were held in towns and cities across the country, and it wasn't just the Prime Minister who felt the pressure. The Interior Minister, the Culture Minister and other senior officials also lost their jobs. Demonstrators say they won't rest until early elections are held. All they say they want is a decent Slovakia. Miloš Thacker, BBC News.
3 African countries that are home to the majority of the continent's elephants have signed a petition asking Britain and the rest of the EU to ban the legal trade in antique ivory. At a wildlife summit in Botswana, the country's president said a complete trade ban would help protect the remaining elephants. Our Africa correspondent Alistair Leithhead reports from Botswana.
Botswana is the last sanctuary for Africa's elephants. Half of the animals left on the continent live here and on its borders. But conservationists say the continuing trade in tusks, be it legal or illegal, to feed the market for ivory in China, means the elephants are still seriously endangered. Thousands of elephants are still being killed for their ivory across Africa every year, leaving orphans like these guys. Although the scale of the poaching is down from what it was a few years ago, more elephants are being killed every year than are being born. It's still a big crisis for Africa's elephants.
We haven't passed the worst of the poaching crisis. I fear the worst is yet to come. The political will to address these issues, unfortunately, is not there. It has been in Botswana, and if our neighbours can learn from Botswana's example, I feel that we can address this poaching crisis.
This is one way to address it, cracking down hard on the poachers and traffickers. A demonstration at the Giants Club Summit shows how lessons learned in counter-terrorism are now being used for anti-poaching. Making sure animals are worth more alive is important, but many here think ending trade is key. This ivory ornament was bought at auction in the UK as an antique and therefore legal to sell, but radiocarbon dating proved it was from an elephant killed 13 years ago.
If the experts can't tell, then how on earth are the public supposed to know? And I think the default setting when you have that level of uncertainty simply has to be, we can't afford to sell ivory.
That's why a global petition is pushing for an EU and UK ban of antique ivory sales, now signed by 3 African presidents.
Well, I think the way we are moving now, when you look at the other countries coming on board, for example, like China, I think they are setting a wonderful example for others to follow, whether it's the UK, the European Union, or anyone else who's involved in the trade.
Banning the legal ivory trade won't stop the illegal killing and orphaning of elephants, but it's another step towards making ivory a less acceptable ornament. Alistair Leithhead, BBC News, Botswana.
Well, let's take a look at some of the other stories making the news now. An Iraqi asylum seeker who set off a homemade bomb on the London Underground has been found guilty of attempted murder. 18-year-old Ahmed Hassan planted the device on a train in southwest London in September. More than 50 people were injured in the explosion. Experts say that if it had detonated fully, it could have claimed many lives. Hollywood trade publications are reporting that John Bailey, the president of the organisation that oversees the Oscar Awards, is being investigated over allegations of sexual misconduct. The reports, citing unnamed sources, say the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences is investigating 3 claims of sexual harassment against its president. Football's world governing body, FIFA, has confirmed that video assistant referees will be used at this year's World Cup in Russia. VAR technology has been trialled in several major leagues this season and will allow for certain referees' decisions to be reviewed. The move was announced by FIFA President Gianni Infantino at the organisation's council meeting in Colombia. Leaders from across Southeast Asia are meeting in Sydney to agree on new measures to combat terrorism in the region. The special ASEAN summit is being hosted by Australia, which is eager to work more closely with member nations. The meeting is expected to result in an agreement to harmonise counter-terrorism laws and share intelligence. Well, earlier I spoke to the BBC's Hall Griffith in Sydney. I asked what the leaders hope to get out of it.
Well, I guess ASEAN is all about cooperation. They don't really talk about domestic problems in each other's countries, but there is a case to be made that the threat from terror in the region is evolving. And as we saw in the Philippines last year with the siege of Marawi, groups affiliating themselves with the so-called Islamic State show that there is potentially a resurgence of extremist violence in the region. So the idea is, as you said, to harmonise the laws so that people will work together, that it's possible probably to extradite suspects from one country to another, and also share intelligence ultimately to prevent attacks. And I think to some extent that's where Australia has an interest in this. We've seen plots halted here in Australia thanks to intelligence from abroad. So it may not be a member of ASEAN, but has a vested interest in making sure that the counter-terror measures in the ASEAN nations work.
Well, you said interestingly there that countries tend not to get involved in each other's domestic affairs. Not quite possible, though, of course, demonstrations there where you are.
Yes, although the demonstrators have been kept well away from the leaders. Primarily the demonstrations have been around the human rights records of two countries. First of all, Cambodia, whose Prime Minister Hun Sen has been in power for over 30 years and is accused of silencing and imprisoning his opponents there. So there's been a strong showing from the Cambodian community here in Sydney and further afield, calling him for him to leave. You may have heard in advance of the summit that he was threatening actually to beat up anyone who burnt an effigy of him. But as I said, the two sides kept very much apart at the moment at least. But also the plight of the Rohingya people, hundreds of thousands of people who fled Myanmar because of the threat of violence there now. Aung San Suu Kyi, the state councillor for Myanmar, is one of the leaders at ASEAN. She's not spoken publicly yet. Of course, she faces a lot of questions around her ability to stop that process and her culpability for the Rohingya suffering. For his part, Australia's Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull, he said he will discuss human rights with other ASEAN leaders, but he'll do it as part of direct bilateral talks, not as part of this summit, because essentially that would break the protocol of not interfering in domestic matters.
So Hywel Griffiths speaking to me earlier. That summit is still ongoing, and of course we'll keep across that for you. Next, skiers in the Republic of Georgia were forced to jump for their lives when a ski lift suffered a severe malfunction in the Caucasus Mountains. At least 12 people were injured when the lift went into reverse and began throwing people off at speed near the country's border with Russia. Georgina Smythe reports.
Holidaymakers watch in horror as a day on the mountain turns to mayhem. A ski lift travelling downhill at Georgia's Gudari resort fails, picking up speed and flinging skiers off backwards on the slope. This skier in an orange jacket is suddenly hurtled into the carnage as lift chairs pile at the bend. Terrified onlookers are unable to do anything but watch. Further uphill, skiers seeing the danger ahead jumped for their lives, abandoning the lift and scrambling out of the way while screaming for others to do the same. Suddenly the lift comes to a stop, and this is the gnarled destruction left behind. The injured extracted from the wreckage and treated close by on the snow. The Gudari resort, which is regarded as the country's best and most popular ski station, confirmed at least 12 people received moderate injuries, but there are no reports of any fatalities. The incident has shocked the industry. The Mountain Resort Development Company of the Ministry of Economy of Georgia stated they had contacted the ski lift producer and will investigate the incident. Georgina Smythe, BBC News.
Well, now here's one for those with a sweet tooth. The world's most expensive chocolate has gone on display in Portugal. The diamond-shaped treat is filled with saffron threads, white truffle, Madagascan vanilla, and coated in 23-carat edible gold leaf. The chocolate is strictly limited edition. Only 1,000 are being made. If you fancy one, though, it's going to cost you well, the price is $9,500. It's not very big either, so you'll probably need two. And the first polar bear cub born in Britain for a quarter of a century has been filmed for the first time after being born in the Scottish Highlands just before Christmas. And as you can see, mum and cub are doing well. The staff at Highland Wildlife Park have yet to find out if it's a boy or a girl.